Our next speaker joins us from Burundi. Our next speaker, Jodi Mikalachki, is Associate Professor of English at the University of Burundi. She holds an interdisciplinary doctorate from Yale University and was a tenured member of the Wellesley College English Department before moving to Burundi in 2008. She has written extensively on gender and nationalism, including The Legacy of Bodice, Gender and Nation in Early Modern England, published by Routledge. Her current project examines violence and its transformation in contemporary Burundian narratives. Sections of this project have appeared as Narrating Violence in Burundian Genocide and Civil War Literature in East African Literatures and Cultures, Emerging Trends, published by Garda Felag. Embodying Burundi After War, Roland Ruggiero's Boho, in Gender Questions, and published in the Journal of Global Catholicism. Please help me to welcome Jodi Mikalachki.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I was going to say good evening because it's evening in Burundi, but good morning to everyone there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Great. And I want to give especially warm greetings to anyone who's there from the group that visited Burundi in December. And I had the pleasure of meeting that group and traveling with you briefly. So I'm very happy to be back at Girard. I joined you for a closing festivity last year in Chicago. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now for my presentation today. It says host disabled, participant screen sharing. Can you see it? Can you see the screen of my presentation? Sorry, I'm trying to see. Can you see me? And when I try to share my presentation, can you see my presentation? Do you see the presentation?
Can you try again to share, because we just allowed you to.
Okay.
Yeah, try again.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. So my presentation explores how contemporary Burundian literature testifies to the ongoing trauma of the 1972 Burundi genocide and its violation of that nation's cultural integrity. Critical work on trauma studies and post-colonial literature suggests that literary texts expand our understanding of historical trauma to include collective experiences. Deploying the concept of cultural trauma, this work shifts attention from the anguish experienced by individuals, typically the focus of the Western Truth and Reconciliation Commission model, to the dramatic loss of identity and meaning suffered by a people. It also recognizes the recurrent nature of trauma in post-colonial societies, moving beyond the Western emphasis on individual testimony about distinct events in the past to develop a broader cultural understanding of how societies are repeatedly traumatized by genocide and its afterlives. Let me emphasize that I strongly support the collection of testimonies about genocide and other human rights violations, and acknowledge their importance both to the individuals who give them and to the nations or communities in which these violations were perpetrated. What I would like to explore with you today is how the imaginative reconstruction of genocide in literary texts enhances our understanding of its effects on collective identity over time. In particular, I will discuss how contemporary Burundian authors represent national topography and the national language as vessels of collective trauma, testifying to a rupture between a people, its territory, and its language. In this case, between the Barundi, or Burundians, Burundi, the physical embodiment of the nation, and Kirundi, the national language. The 2021 progress report of the Burundi Truth and Reconciliation Commission expresses a similar finding when it claims that the 1972 genocide affected, quote, a multifaceted fracture of national identity, unquote. Just as the consequences of the 1972 genocide continue to be felt in contemporary Burundian society, so the cultural trauma it affected continues to inform contemporary Burundian literature, which testifies to the transformation of the nation into something unrecognizable and unintelligible to its own people. At the same time, however, contemporary Burundian literature also participates in the work of national healing, cultivating a sense of personal and collective authority over the cultural trauma of genocide, and asserting the continued relevance of Burundian humanism. An emphasis on life-affirming and activist processes has been identified as one of the key dynamics animating post-colonial literature and societies as they address cultural trauma. I will conclude my presentation with some remarks about this dynamic in contemporary Burundian literature. Let me begin, however, with the disfigurement of national topography in Burundian genocide narratives. Survivor accounts of the 1972 Burundi genocide emphasize a sense of spatial disorientation in which what had once been a familiar natural environment becomes strange, dangerous, and antagonistic. In her analysis of flight narratives compiled from the 1972 refugees in Tanzania, ethnographer Lisa Malki notes the recurrent transformation of familiar Burundian topography into a space of disconnected terror and chaos. Informants' accounts seem to document, she writes, first the transformation of a recognizable, familiar social landscape into an unintelligible chaos, an apocalyptic landscape. And second, the transformation of persons socially connected to their surroundings into mere bodies buffeted and propelled pell-mell through strange terrain. Terrain made the more terrifying, one would think, by the awareness that it was, not long ago, familiar. What Malki observes in these 1972 flight narratives is a fundamental estrangement between a people and their territory, between the Barundi and the Burundi. Both the land itself and people's relationship to it become unrecognizable. For an agrarian society such as Burundi's, the fracturing of a people's relationship to the land is particularly traumatic. Extending beyond the important material consequences of losing a means to sustenance and a way of life, it impacts a nation's ability to imagine itself as an integrated whole. This sense of estrangement from a once familiar relationship to the land is not limited to 1972 flight narratives. It also figures in writing by genocide survivors who remained in Burundi and continues to inform 21st century Burundian texts, engaging both the genocide and the 1993-2005 civil war. In her 2021 survivors account of the 1972 Burundi genocide, Janine Herageza writes of how the rural landscape of her childhood seemed to, quote, zip her into silence, enforcing the political injunction on expressing grief after the 1972 genocide, in which she lost her father, brother, and other family members. Zip it was what I thought I heard from the clouds, the banana trees, corn, sorghum, the bushes, mountains, and valleys. Zip it from anywhere and anything. They seemed to say together in unison, zip it. It was as if it wasn't just the government and its representatives that would punish us if we didn't, but all the forces of nature that enveloped us. Mirroring instruments of political and social control, the forces of nature function as a network of surveillance in Nihirageza's childhood perception. What was once a fruitful and sustaining environment becomes a place of dangerous exposure. Basic Burundian food crops, bananas, corn, sorghum, the country's characteristic mountains and valleys, and the clouds that release its abundant rain constitute and enforce a topography of punitive silence. Nihirageza's child self walks on it and through it, condemned to eat her silence under its vigilant clouds. In her evocation of food crops, Nihirageza literalizes the linguistic relationship between culture and cultivation, figuring cultural trauma as the transformation of a nurturing landscape into a space of deadly judgment. The familiar relationship of an agrarian people to its land has been replaced by an imagined apparatus of state control over a fearful and silenced population. In this new configuration, the state exists only to monitor and enforce, offering nothing to nourish or sustain its people. If national topography has been rendered unrecognizable by the genocide and its repressive aftermath, the national language has also been disfigured. Nihirageza includes a catalog of Kirundi terms deployed against Hutus after the genocide to stigmatize them as enemies of the nation. We were called degrading and demoralizing names. Igihere, bedbug, Inyanka Burundi, Aransi Bigihugu, enemies of the nation, Avichani, genocidaire, murderers, Inkodzi Zikibi, evildoers, Abamenja, Abayahudi, Abayuda, from Judas, Judah, Iscariot, traitors, and Maimai Murere, a nickname for Congolese rebels of that time. We were members of the majority ethnic group, yet we felt like complete outcasts. Outcasts in their own country, Hutu genocide survivors internalized a dehumanizing nomenclature of blame that inscribed them within their own language as haters of Burundi, Inyanka Burundi, and enemies of the nation, Avansi Vigihugu. In Nihirageza's childhood memories of the 1972 genocide, national topography and the national language are transformed and weaponized, becoming deadly threats rather than constitutive elements of a cohesive national identity. The same phenomenon shapes Pacifique Iranghunda's 2022 memoir of growing up a generation later during the Civil War. Recalling how the onset of the war transformed the agrarian society of his early childhood, he notes that, quote, new words appeared. Ibinywa Maraso, the blood drinkers, and Imvyam Furambi, deeds of the wrong firstborn. That's a literal translation. I'm told that what it actually stands for is rapists. And a new expression that meant one after another, gently on a razor. Like Nihirageza, he pairs this violent disfigurement of the national language with the frightening transformation of familiar topography into a landscape of danger, in which one struggles to distinguish the shape of a black stump with branches from a man pointing a gun at night, or a long blade of grass across the path from the thin string tied to a landmine. Historian Alexandra Hatungimana also links spatial and linguistic disruption in his account of how Burundians were parceled into new categories of citizenship during the Civil War, from repatriated refugees to internally displaced persons living in camps to those dispersed in the countryside or the bush. Observing ironically that Kirundi was, quote, enriched during this period by French loanwords such as umu déplacé, from déplacé or internally displaced person, and umu sinistré, from sinistré or disaster victim, Hatungimana asserts that the Civil War affected a spatial breakup of long-standing community structures, indeed of Burundian society. The testimony of Nihirageza and other survivors, however, indicates that the spatial linguistic rupture Hatungimana ascribes to the Civil War originated with the 1972 genocide, when national topography and the national language first registered as disaster victims or casualties of political violence. What is the role then of contemporary Burundian literature in addressing this cultural trauma? Near the conclusion of Juvenal Ngogwanubusa's 2012 novel, The Avalanche Years, which is an acerbic political allegory of national violence, the character of Kadzodza, whose name means the future, takes a pessimistic view of the future of Burundian literature. The Burundi of today is a reservoir and compost heap of themes from a literature dominated by death. A Burundian writer has no right to babble about the beauty of the hills, nor leisure to sing the praises of a pleasant and verdant countryside, or dream about the splendor of Lake Tanganyika. Too much blood has been spilled. For a long time to come, our literature will be a literature that testifies to the evil of Burundi, or it will not exist at all. Kadzodza's words are indeed prophetic. Contemporary Burundian literature is very much concerned with testifying to the evils of the nation's political violence. From Alois Misago's 2012 novel, The Descent into Hell, which focuses on a schoolboy escaping the 1972 genocide, to Marie-Thérèse Toy's Weep Not Refugee, a novel engaging the lives of refugees and returnees during the Civil War, Gael Fai's Small Country, 2016, which narrates the induction of children and youth into political violence in Bujumbura, and Irankunda's 2022 memoir of growing up during the Civil War. At the same time that they represent and memorialize these periods of national violence, however, these texts also participate in processes of national healing, reimagining the nation in ways that extend and deepen the Burundi TRC's important work of collecting individual testimonies. Roland Rugero's 2012 novel, Bajo, set in the aftermath of the Civil War, begins with a description of Burundian topography that recalls Nihirageza's projection of punitive surveillance onto the landscape. Quote, "The heavens are naked this November. Ashamed, they try to find a few clouds to cover themselves under the pitiless sun that resolutely and deliberately exposes their nudity to the light of day. Bent among the numerous hills of Hariho, Kanya Hill has throughout the dry season bravely endured the sharp blows of the heat that still torments the country. She needs to breathe. She waits for rain, thirsts for air and moisture. Kanya is still draped in eucalyptus trees belonging to the state forest, numerous, jagged, tall. The ground allows their dry, pungent leaves to race over it. No water. The sky has become wicked. Or rather, men have become guilty of too many sins, punishment from God, too much evil in this country." Rugero's Hariho represents Burundian topography as both the deliberate agent and the passive object of punishment. The state emerges as burdensome and dangerous in the image of the forest that drapes Kanya's back like a flag, its eucalyptus trees numerous, jagged, and tall, like an army. As the description concludes, the eye of judgment shifts from the landscape to ascribe guilt to men, punishment to God, and too much evil to this country. In the guilty confusion of Hariho, suffering and judgment are everywhere. Yet by the novel's conclusion, an innocent young man who seemed certain to be killed by a mob has been delivered, though not without much suffering. The old woman who reflects on his story concludes the narrative with the Burundian proverb, "Amagara namazia seseka tibayore." Life is water that spills on the ground and cannot be picked up. In this image, water, so painfully absent from national topography in the novel's opening description, finally soaks the ground. Throughout the novel, the old woman figures as a vessel for Burundian humanism, deployed as folktale, proverb, and her own thoughtful engagement with Burundi's three ethnicities in the novel's only passage to mention these loaded terms. The one-eyed old woman respects everything that lives. Since childhood, she has respected the Twas, the other ethnic group after Hutus and Tutsis. There are murmurs she might be one of them through the blood of her father. Bah, the essential thing is to live. In the old woman's humanist vision of Burundi, the essential thing is to live, respecting all living things and acknowledging the blood ties of a national family that includes everyone. Rugero himself acknowledges this in a 2020 interview, saying that, quote, "We Burundians are condemned to live together. We must work for that," unquote. Though Rugero writes in French, he begins every chapter of Bajo with a proverb in its original form and deploys Kirundi elsewhere in the body of his text. Together with Burundian humanism, the national language figures as a resource for addressing cultural trauma in a post-conflict setting. Though violent injustice continues to haunt this setting, the language and forms of Burundian humanism work to integrate this cultural trauma within a national history that is both longer and deeper than the cycles of post-colonial violence that have afflicted Burundi and other nations. Gesturing toward this history, Rugero quotes a line from the national anthem in his epigraph. You were crushed, you did not die. Like the badly beaten but ultimately delivered protagonist of Rugero's novel, Burundi, however crushed by colonialism and cycles of post-colonial violence, is not dead. The question now is how to live as a nation that both acknowledges and integrates the cultural trauma of colonialism and its post-colonial legacies, how to flourish as a country that respects all its constituents, whether Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. This is where contemporary Burundian literature expands and deepens the important work of collecting individual testimonies. In its capacity to reimagine the nation, literature cultivates and develops the national imagination, foregrounding the national language and allowing readers to envision national territory as a space that includes and represents them all. And national literature also allows Burundians to claim authority over their own stories and history, too often recounted from the perspective of foreign scholars, journalists, and development organizations. Irene Visser has argued that one of the key lacunae in Western trauma studies is the failure to theorize the dynamics of life-affirming and activist processes that animate post-colonial literatures and societies. Contemporary Burundian literature, I suggest, testifies both to the cultural trauma of genocide and to imaginative processes of memorialization and healing that affirm the life and dignity of the Burundian nation and its culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mikalachki. We have 5 minutes for questions. There are no questions on virtual platform, but I have just one quick question for you, Professor Mikalachki. You noted at the beginning of your lecture that Burundi never experienced violence up until 1972. But then there was a kind of some form of injustice which provoked or which bred bitterness, or which left bitterness among the people. So my question is, are you trying to suggest that the genocide was born of this bitterness that was not addressed? So that's actually the first part of my question. And the second part is, how can you be sure that literature will not enhance or the festering of that bitterness. So basically, when we tell stories, in most cases, we tell stories of our pain. So how can you be sure that these stories will not basically enhance the bitterness and therefore enable a future genocide? Thank you.
Thank you so much for both of those very rich questions. So for the first question, I began with a translation from something in the 2021 progress report of the Burundi TRC. Their claim, and I think I would agree with it, is that on a national level, Burundi had not experienced massive interethnic violence before 1972. There was violence, well, there were many kinds of violence, but there was certainly in the years leading up to 1972, in the first decade of independence, the political elite was more and more construing itself in ethnic terms. And there was violence against trade unionists in 1962 in Bujumbura, and they were all Hutus who were killed. In 1965, there was what you might almost call a rehearsal for the genocide. There was an uprising in a particular province of Burundi that was led by Hutus who were increasingly excluded from the political sphere. And there were massive reprisals against that, and that caused a purging of the armed forces of many Hutu officers, not just in that province. And tensions were rising throughout the 1960s, but these were largely tensions among the political elite and intellectuals, people who had been to university, who had studied abroad, and even some senior high school students, I would say. For the most part, there was an uprising at the beginning in late April, early May of 1972 of armed Hutu bands, and who certainly hoped to lead a massive Hutu violence against Tutsis and usher in a new political era in Burundi. It didn't work because very few people were on that page with them. Most of the Hutus across the country who were called in to prisons or police centers went very willingly, knowing that they were innocent and just assuming that, after a couple of days in jail, they would be released, and they were all killed. So this the national experience of genocidal violence and national participation in it, I think, was new in 1972. So there was some bitterness from people in the region with the 1965 uprising and its reprisals, and there was a lot of bitterness in this very small group of intellectuals and would-be civil servants who were not getting the positions that they wanted. I mean, I don't want to dismiss their frustrations either. So that would be my response to your first question. I hope it's helpful. Your second question, which is, of course, the stories we tell are our stories. I teach a course at the University of Burundi, an undergraduate course in which I teach Janine's survivor's account. I also teach Pacifique Rangunda, is a Tutsi who survived the civil war a generation later, and I teach texts by different kinds of Burundians about their experience of violence and political violence in Burundi. And I start with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's essay, The Danger of a Single Story. And that if that's true for all of Africa, it's also true for Burundi. And we say, who could tell the story of Burundi? Which one person could tell it? I find Roland Rugero's novel, Bajo, which I do recommend to people. There's a good English translation. You can get it online. in which he largely avoids these ethnic terms, except in that one statement in which he brings them together. Very, very much dedicated to reconciliation without papering over the massive violence. And certainly his father suffered. He survived the 1972 genocide, but he suffered a lot, and the Ruggiero family was again displaced during the Civil War. You know, a good Truth and Reconciliation Commission that allows people to hear many stories can also be helpful in this. I put my greatest faith actually in grassroots organizations that bring people together all over to tell their stories. And people hear each other's stories during those meetings. And I'm told that they're usually 3-day workshops, that the first day is very tense, because people who are from different groups and have really suffered a lot from each other, and sometimes from these specific people they find with them in these workshops, or their families, are very frightened and angry and anxious to be in the same space with them. Day 2 of these workshops, everybody tells their story without comment. And by the end of that day, people have a very different feeling about one another. I went to a celebration of one of those workshops. Sorry? Sorry, I'm hearing other voices.
Never mind. Just keep going.
So, okay, thank you. Anyway, the one man talked about how he ended up giving a ride on his bicycle to one of the men who had unjustly accused him years before, causing him to spend 11 years in prison. So I think the storytelling in spaces where people know how to hold this space and with well-trained facilitators is really healing, because everybody hears that they weren't the only people to suffer. And they may understand without excusing the violence done against them and their families, they may understand better where it came from. I would say, yeah, people do sometimes react. I mean, I've had students react to Janine's survivor's account by saying, well, she only tells one side. Say, well, she's telling her story. If you have a different story, tell it. Another student who talked about reading something out of Pacifiquirang Hunda, talking about the violence of a particular Hutu armed movement in one of the provinces of Burundi. And that student said he should talk about what the army was doing to us there. And I said, well, that's your story. Why don't you tell it? And he did tell it in a composition that was very moving. So one of the things I'm trying to do with my students is to get them to write their stories. And I never require anybody, I ask them to write a vivid memory of childhood. I never require them to write about anything that's violent or painful to them. And some write charming stories, funny stories, sad stories that have nothing to do with political violence. But quite a few of them do write about their experience of the Civil War or the unrest in 2015-16. I was a little scared when I started doing that. I asked the advice of a number of colleagues, do you think I can ask them to write? They said they thought it would be helpful to the students. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody's been traumatized by doing that. And then I actually take excerpts from a lot of those essays and produce maybe 12 of them in a handout and have students read from them, and we discuss them in class.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have just 2 minutes for a very short question. And the questioner has promised to keep it short, and your answer will also be short, so that we.
Oh, my question is very short.
Right.
I just wanted you to just make a statement or respond to the idea, you know, we have the Western aphorism, the pen is mightier than the sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until the sword silences all the pens. So my question to you is, what's the role of memory in your understanding of justice? Because part of literature's work is to patch memory together. What's the role of memory in your understanding of justice within the context of Burundi?
So memory is absolutely essential to justice. And I think that's part of the work that the Burundi TRC is doing, is gathering memories. Memory of trauma is tricky, not because it's false, but because it's overwhelming and often fragmented. And I think that's one of the ways that literature can be helpful, because it doesn't have to say, okay, this is what happened on April 29th, 1972. One of the things I really admire in Janine's survivor's account is the way she talks about everything that was necessary for her before she could begin really to recover her memories of the genocide. And what I find interesting is it seems to be works of art that really helped her to do that. I mean, that overwhelmed her at first, like the movie Hotel Rwanda, but then photography exhibits